my beliefs have evolved so much over the past few years. And it's like just jumping right out there with, is the rapture real? Is like, ooh, I'm coming out with it. I'm coming out with things that I was taught my whole life, believed my whole life. Oh, sorry. This is Dale, by the way. I will link his YouTube channel with his amazing documentaries below.
Thank you, Katie. No, it's great to be able to talk to you. And yeah, it is very important. Do you think the book of Revelation is about the end of the world? Surely if the book of Genesis is about the beginning, it would be logical to think that Revelation is about the end.
You can't read the book of Revelation chronologically as if it's some series of events that's going to play out in order from kind of chapter 5 to chapter 22.
At times it seems that we're being presented less with a straightforward chronological sequence.
Does the Bible really give us the sequence of events that will take place in the end times? Or is this just a fragment of the imagination?
Well, there is no detailed plan, apart from the basic framework, that there would be a time of tribulation on earth preceding the Messianic age.
Who was left behind? Noah and his family. It was good to be left behind.
This whole debate is based on an underlying assumption that there is a 7-year tribulation at all.
If you read through the book of Revelation, the word Antichrist isn't in there.
I should perhaps say that the term Antichrist is never used in the book of Revelation, despite the impression you might get from Google.
I don't think that the second coming of Jesus is something that's going to happen either in my lifetime in that way or at any point in the future.
He's not going to give us a timetable. He never was going to give us a timetable.
You know, no one knows the day nor the hour, neither the sun.
Any claim that people say we are in the end times right now just would not be true. Like, it's great to be able to hand these things out a bit, isn't it?
I think that a lot of people who are raised with the evangelical end times thing have a way of pushing aside a lot of issues because they think it doesn't matter because Jesus is coming soon. We'll be caught up in the air to meet him and it won't be any of my problem.
Yeah, sort of that. It almost promotes escapism, doesn't it?
Exactly.
I've always gone back to the Bible to see what it actually says. We can filter it so much. And so I was probably raised a little bit like you, that this is what is going to happen. But I've always had an open-minded approach. And I suppose it's fair to say I probably did have a little bit of fear of end times, especially when I think about what's going to happen to my daughter and her generation. Is this seriously the future that the world is going to embrace? And when I made my documentary and I found out that it's not actually as straightforward as this, and it's a lot of these end time futuristic theories do have some problems with them. And the more I realize is that I think all of us need to keep open-minded. Even I will admit that I don't have all the answers. So my film is really to challenge people to, keep digging, keep investigating, and take the evidence, but think critically for yourself.
And there's just some bad theology and bad literal readings of things meant for different times, and meanings just completely changed around to, it's made me so frustrated. Like, what can I trust of what I was raised with when it's not their fault that they taught me what wasn't good, but somebody taught it to them, somebody taught it to them. Like the whole rapture thing only comes from the 1800s, from a vision had by a young person, picked up by a con man, brought to America, like did it, and now it's like it's definitely gonna happen.
Yeah, it's interesting there that you've identified the sort of dominoes effect. It's almost like you can't blame people for teaching this because it's what they've always believed and it's what society has always taught us. And so I think every so often it is helpful to sort of investigate that dominoes effect, isn't it? And
Mm-hmm.
really look at, is this what it is saying?
That's something that's so heavily weighed down on a young person growing up, is that it becomes this like, it's going to be so terrible. Maybe we'll miss the tribulation. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll have guns put to our head, and we'll have to say whether we believe in God, or maybe we'll have to get a mark to be able to buy or sell food. And it just gets built up and up. And there's so many people who genuinely think that like Biden is the Antichrist and this is the beginning of the end, and Trump was the last hope for a real America. Like, I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but
yeah, I think I've identified a couple of things there from what you just mentioned. I think first of all, eschatology in general was never meant to be this message of fear, and doom and gloom. It was meant to be hope. And the early church theologians always seen it as a message of hope.
Mm.
And I think with the rise of rapture and what we call now dispensationalism, which is an end time view of seeing things, it does seem that this idea of fear has seemed to have been the most dominant force. And especially with American Christianity, which seems to be heavily promoting the Zionistic way of reading the New Testament, which is, God has another plan for Israel once again, and he might. But it's just interesting, even during Trump's reign, that he was very Israel focused. And that, I think that too feeds into this end time sort of approach, that, there's going to be some major war in the Middle East. The Antichrist is going to rise up out of that situation. And then the other thing I would say is, of course, we need to understand the nature of how the Bible was written. These end time events of the sun going dark and the moon turning into blood, that's very metaphoric language. And so we can't enforce our Western interpretation on those verses. So we really need to think critically about how we understand the Bible and how we want to make America in line with Israel. Are those modern ideas that we've placed on the Bible?
Yes.
And it was just interesting. You mentioned, Joe Biden being the Antichrist. When I was in Australia and New Zealand, there was such a divide between Donald Trump. Of some people thought he was the Antichrist, and other people thought he was God's gift to humankind. And the amount of the diversion that was there was really interesting on a cultural level. Yeah,
it is interesting. I don't remember where I've read this. It could have been in this book. It could have been in other videos and people. I think it's reverse. Screen is reversed here. Unraptured by Zach Hunt.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But that when they were putting the books of the Bible together, deciding what's going to be these 66 books of the New Testament or whatever, there were other end times chunks of books in there, and they just chose that one. But it was a way of talking about things in a future tense to give people in a really hard situation hope.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if you saw my film, this was brought up, that we call it apocalyptic literature, that kind of writing. And of course, there was loads of them before and after Revelation. But like you said, Revelation was put into the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so for a Western culture, we seem to think that that's the only book that's got this hidden code of, predicting the end of the world, where, like you said, this language was to give people hope in their present situation by looking at the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, another challenge for us as Westerners to think critically when we place our ideas onto these texts. Absolutely, yeah.
So the rapture was never ever mentioned in the Bible, was it?
It seems to be the case, yes. And again, in my film, I identified the two major verses that's used. One is, Jesus says it will be in the days of Noah, one will be taken, one will be left. Mm-hmm. And of course, when you think back in the days of Noah, it was the wicked who were taken away, and it was the faithful who were left behind. So it's the opposite.
Right.
And then the second Thessalonian one, or 1 Thessalonians 4, sorry, it talks about Jesus coming down and us meeting him into the clouds. But again, the whole context to me seems to be that Christ is returning. It's not like Christ comes, then there's a 7-year tribulation, then he comes again. It seems to be a one-off. Christ comes, and then we will live with him on earth. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of Christians escaping any kind of tribulation period that may follow. Now, yes, there may be tribulations in the world at any time, but the evidence to me seems to suggest that Christ comes and then we live with him for 1,000 years, if it is that long as Revelation speaks about. And so you could understand why maybe people would see a rapture in there. But I think if we dig deeper, we actually see it's the return of Christ and us living with him on earth. Now, we don't know at what point, when will the new heaven and new earth come? That's obviously going to happen as well. And so it's unclear how long Christ is going to reign here,
I will tell you something that is related to all this. When I was a kid and I was starting to think, maybe Santa isn't real after all, because it's my mom's handwriting that's saying from Santa on the packages, and it's the same wrapping paper that's used from my parents. So he's probably not real. And my mom saying, okay, you should really, really tell your dad about this. And I was like nervous, and he was nervous. And then when I said, I don't think Santa's real, he was like, oh, I'm so relieved. I was so worried that you were going to think that I lied about everything, like even God. And because he had a really hard time with coming to grips with everything his parents lied about, Tooth Fairy, Easter Bunny. He's like, next you're going to tell me there's no Easter Bunny. And I have an aversion to things now, because I'm like, well, you didn't bother to see if the rapture wasn't really in the Bible. You just went ahead and taught that, and all these other people taught, like, what can I even trust?
Yeah, it's amazing the amount of things Christians assume is true in the Bible. And like I said, the reason I made the film was I've always had an open mind and to return to see what the Bible's actually saying. And yeah, sometimes that can cause people not liking that approach, can't it? Or for some people, it's a brand new revelation. And so responses will always vary, won't they? But yeah, or the things we assume to be true.
What would you recommend to someone like me who's like, I still want to believe, but I'm like really turned off to even reading my Bible currently, because I'm like, well, what Western American propaganda have I been raised with that's clouding what I'm reading? Like, how do I embrace the Bible knowing that it's not perfect, because there have been mistranslations printed right into it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. If I could just give you an example, and I'll try and answer it if that's okay. If we have time, I've been recently doing some research also on the Exodus and the Red Sea, and what body of water did Moses part. And then that too, I found out that the Red Sea is actually an incorrect translation from the Hebrew. It was actually added in from the Greek thousands of years later. Now, what I found out in my investigating is that the Red Sea crossing did still happen somewhere in that region. You've got the Gulf of Suez, the Red Sea, and the Gulf of Aqaba. So I would say it's maybe they got it wrong. They've just used general principles to get the translation. So I can understand why they would have chose Red Sea. So I just use that as an example of, did they get it wrong? And are there other verses in the Bible where they got it wrong? Read it as if, we're reading it in the lens of a first century Jew, understanding language and literature. But I think also knowing that God can speak to us at any time, at any age in the world. And hopefully that will sort of still speak to us in our Western filter of certain Bible verses. It's also helpful to really understand how language and literature works, because there's other verses, that could seem quite nasty. Things like, women should be silent in church. Well, that could seem very nasty if you read it at face value. But again, if you read the context, you find that Paul is right into a pagan culture where women goddesses were worshipped. And so he's worried that people will embrace Christianity in that way. And so it doesn't actually mean that men or women should be silent in church. He's right into a certain issue at that time. Jesus was actually Jewish. He wasn't Christian. Christian was a term that came later. And so we need to understand that Jesus too was a Jew speaking to, a Jewish context.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons why the Pharisees, it always makes me wonder why the Pharisees rejected him so much, because they were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. Why was there so much conflict? But of course, I think some answers was that the temple at that time had become so corrupt, and they had started adding all these other laws called fence laws that wasn't in the Torah. And so Jesus came into conflict with the very people who should have represented the kingdom of God. And of course, then with the new covenant, and then the church goes out to the Gentiles, it's almost as if the nation of Israel overflows now to the other nations. And that's, of course, where we get the term Christian, Christ follower, from. So that's a really good example of understanding who Jesus was, and that we need to understand the Jewish side of things as well.
Do you think there's something else to say to tie things together, or some message to say to people who think the world is coming to an end and we're both going straight to hell for contradicting what they've been taught their whole lives?
Yeah, it just came to me actually as you were just speaking. I think maybe the promotion of rapture in general could be twofold, really. One is, and if one of the scholars I interviewed said this is very true of American Christianity, I maybe here as well, there is an element of escapism, that Christians want to escape trouble. And that too is not biblical, because, the first century Christians were persecuted terribly under Nero and Diocletian. And even in the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, there's always been the persecution of Christians. And so for us to expect that we're the special ones and escape trouble, that would, not be biblical. But yeah, that's one side of it. But another side of it is there seems to be an element, not just in America, I think in a lot of places, that we seem to want to punish people. And I know, yes, there needs to be a repentance of sins. I know that. But I would also say that is between God and the individual. We're just commissioned to spread the good news and be honest at the same time. If there's inappropriate behavior, I think we maybe have to identify those issues. But it's almost like this end time game is almost used as a weapon to scare people. And so I think the fear of going to hell, like you mentioned, would also be, we seem to want to punish people who are not Christians, but also, like you just said, those of us who sort of study the Bible and think critically, a lot of people don't like that as well. I think as long as we can approach it in love, being humble, and say, look, I may not have all the answers, but this is what the evidence seems to be pointing to. I mean, even now, after I made my film, I've got some people in my church who I know who are not going to agree with it. They are very futuristic in their interpretation, and that's absolutely fine. The film was never made to force people. It was made to give people an open perspective on the Bible and think critically for themselves.
I sometimes when I've had conversations, because I've had a lot of conversations on this channel, and sometimes it goes into my faith struggles and doubts and anger, just anger, the disappointment of people who've gone down conspiracy theory holes and fear, just been sucked into fear. And I feel like it's just so much better now. Each conversation it gets better, and like I'm able to not, I don't feel angry right now. I feel more disappointed, and it feels like I'm a little bit closer to being able to pick up my Bible again. I'm a little bit closer to not blaming God for how badly people have messed up, have distorted the image of him.
Yeah, and then something else that just came to me again as you said those words, which was really helpful. It is incredible, isn't it, that God has given people free will, and that he knew that his word was going to be distorted, and yet he gave it to us, and yet he knew that people with their own free will are going to distort this. And so, like you've mentioned, you get disappointed in the way people react. I think it's really encouraging that you've been able to pick up your Bible again, and hopefully,
well, not yet. I try, and then I'm like,
yeah. But hopefully, you can come back to that message that God is love and He does not change, and almost, are we able to just set aside what is the messy stuff with humans and what is the basic core message that God is saying in the Bible.
I just am a little bit annoyed at God. Like, seriously, dude, why can't you just say, hey, I'm not with that conspiracy crap? Like, just come out from behind the curtain for a sec. Jesus got a dove. I joked about this with somebody else. Jesus got a dove on his head in his baptism, like for a bat to land on Trump or something, like opposite.
That is a very good point. Does God anoint Trump, or when bad things have been done in the name of Christianity, like the Crusades, or in World War II, Nazism was preached from the pulpit. What does God do with those kind of situations? And I was noticing in my Old Testament studies how God doesn't always bless different empires that came up and went, but He certainly did use them to bring about the better plan for Israel and for the church. And it's hard, isn't it, to know what is God's greater plan when we see people who we don't agree with or have radical ideas. Whose side is God on? And it's a really difficult question, isn't it?
I mean, it's like in America, maybe this happens in Great Britain too, but since you didn't become a Christian until you were a teenager, it's maybe different. But like in America, there will be little kids and sports teams, and they'll both pray to win. It's like, oh, come on. God doesn't care about who wins your stupid game. Like, it's not so two-sided. It's not like God loves the Democrats and hates the Republicans or vice versa. It's like we're such a tiny little insignificant speck in the fabric of humanity. God's on humanity's side. But it seems like the side that has the worst fruit, that bears the worst fruit, that hurts the most people, how could God be on that side?
Yes, it's interesting. If you watch the movie again, one of the scholars mentioned that no evil lasts forever. And I think if any empire comes up that does bad things, it may seem more powerful at the time, but evil does not win history. And I think God ultimately, has a better plan in mind. I think I heard a sermon recently. It was really interesting that it was leading up to Christmas, and before Jesus was born, there was all these different empires that came up, one overthrew the other, all this bad stuff was happening. And it was almost like, instead of God stopping them right there and then, He was almost 10 steps ahead of them, because of those situation, Christ was able to come into a certain time in a certain context. So all that back history, God went 10 steps ahead to prepare the way. And I just wonder, with all the messy stuff now, God is 10 steps ahead of us. And, yes, some bad things may happen, but I just think God will ultimately orchestrate things for good in the long run. And that's the hope that we can hold on to, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much for this conversation.
You're welcome. I hope it's helped you, and I hope some of the answers were some of the things you were looking for.
Yeah, looking forward to ruffling some feathers. Oh,
I think your question was, what was my first engagement with American politics? Did you say something along those lines?
Could have been. Go, if you have something good to say, go for it.
No, that's fine. Yeah, the first sort of heavily engagement with American politics from a British perspective, I think would have been 9/11, because, not long after that, you guys had the invasion of Iraq with George W. Bush. And I very much remember in the UK, Tony Blair, our prime minister at the time, a lot of people saw him as sort of the president's puppet in a way. And that was I've looked into it since that time as well, but that was a very sort of hard going time for us in this nation. How much of America was fought in Great Britain and vice versa. So that was an interesting study. And I just find it interesting now with when Trump was in office, Christians' reactions to him from this country. And it was almost as if the older, sort of more conservative men, not so much the women, were very pro-Trump. And again, I think it goes back to that sort of being loud and abrupt, and what type of Christianity are we wanting to embrace. And it just seems like some people just like that, don't they? They just like the loudness of Christianity. I just wonder if a more subtle approach is a better method, I think.
Jesus was only loud and abrasive to the people so stuck in their religiosity that they were condemning and blocking the way to God and forgiveness and healing. He was only gentle with everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he was loud again with the very religious system that should have promoted him, and it rejected him. Yeah, and he was loving to prostitutes, sinners, tax collectors. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I want the real Jesus, not the politicized one. I look at the Bible and it just looks like this book of propaganda.
Sort of what image of Jesus are we wanting to promote in a way? Thinking through those issues. Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting thing to think about, how even just the gospel writers, try to get as close as they could to the historical Jesus, but also, they would have had to put their own sort of theology on the historical Christ as well. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think they were writing to a certain people, and it's like when you write books today, isn't it? Or make films, you promote it to a certain kind of audience.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think they maintained the true nature of Christ, which was, like you said, loving when he was loving, hard when he needed to be hard. And we can have that good news today.
Yeah, definitely check out Dale's documentary. He presents a lot of really good points to think about. He doesn't knock you over the head with it. Maybe you're very angry watching this video. Maybe you've not even made it this far. But if you're still willing to think, to use your brain, use that brain that God gave you and really investigate. He's put 6 months into putting this hour and a half?
Was that my one?
Yeah.
2.5.
2.5. Okay, this 2.5 hour documentary. So you can really go deep there. I think I've only managed to watch like the first hour or so. But yes, it was, I learned so much in that. Just in the first few minutes, I'm like, whoa, this is fascinating. So you've done a really great job with that.
Thank you, Katie. It's really encouraging to hear that it's helping people. That's the main goal, to help people think and to help them spiritually.
There's nothing, it doesn't show a lack of faith to learn. Learning and science and critical thinking have gotten a bad reputation among many raised Christian, and that is embarrassing and needs to be corrected. Like, if you believe that God is omnipotent and able to do it all, then God's not scared of science and critical thinking. His brain is supposed to be a lot bigger than our brain, so.
Yeah, really quickly, I was just sort of thinking about how I know some people don't believe in evolution, some Christians do, and that's not a problem. But I just really think how that doesn't worry God. You know, he knew that this was going to come about.
Oh no, what am I gonna do? Yeah. Thank you. So
thank you, Katie.
I want to say hugs. That's how I end my videos. And I hope we'll talk again some other time.
Will do. Thank you. Maybe I'll do an interview with yourself one day as well.
Cool. I'd love that.
Cool. Thank you, Katie. God bless him.
God bless. Do you have any book recommendations for understanding a first century Jewish perspective in reading the Bible with better understanding?
Yes. It depends how academic you want to get, but there's some authors like N.T. Wright. He's a very famous English theologian. It can be quite academic now and then, but he gives a good first century context to it. I think maybe other authors would be people like Keith Ward. I think he's a biblical scholar who looks at what does the Bible actually say on certain issues, and how do we understand the first century context and then apply it to the 21st century in a Western context. So yes, I could send some lists for you as well.
Yeah, sounds good. I have this one, but it's interesting. I haven't made time to read it. It's not written from a Christian perspective, but it's a biography of the Bible.
Oh yes, Karen Armstrong. She's really good as well.
I really want to thank you for making it this far, especially if this made you uncomfortable, if this challenged something that you've been taught your whole life to, that you are so sure about. And it all starts thinking critically, trusting, and actually looking to the Bible, not just what we were taught our whole lives, because we have to be willing to see where they don't meet up. And it's hard, and it's uncomfortable, and it hurts, but I think ultimately it will lead us closer to Jesus and further away from an idol of Jesus. And this has all been very testing. This has been really difficult for me. I want to get closer. I want to find a place where I can trust things better. But I'm in a process. It's a work in process. We can change. We can grow, but we have to give ourselves the time and space to do that. And I believe that there is freedom in finding out the truth about the rapture thing that we've been told, and about these end times things that we've been told. There's so much fear, and we'll be saved and they will burn, and all this just icky stuff. Icky. I don't want to be known as that kind of Christian anymore. Read my description on this channel. You'll see what kind of person I am. I wanted to say one more time, please go check out Dale's 2.5 hour long documentary. This guy dug deep. He talked to so many Bible scholars, so many experts. He dug into it for himself, going to the roots, the eschatology, big word there. Please go check that out, and yeah, educate yourself. Don't take anybody's word for anything. Always learn for yourselves, because that's really smart. So, I've got some more hard-hitting, feather-ruffling conversations coming up. I'll sprinkle them in amongst fun, getting to know people ones too, because I don't want to be heavy all the time. But I think that this video deserves a like, because it took me some courage to hit the upload button. I know this is big deal stuff. So, yeah. Also, disliking is fine too. The YouTube algorithm sees it all the same and it helps my channel, so. Of course, if you dislike this video, you're probably not watching this. Anyway, I'm gonna give hugs now. I care about you. I value your opinion. Please, if there's big disagreements and stuff, please be kind and gentle and loving in the comment section, like everybody always has been. I've dealt with very few trolls and haters. So anyway, I'm gonna say hugs. You are loved. Let's continue to think. Let's continue to grow and learn. Yeah.